Thank you for joining us today. I'm Farah, I'm from Julie's Bicycle, and I'm really excited about this event, and I hope it's a day that's really inspiring and that generates a lot of discussion and a lot of inspiration and some good connections between people. So before we get into it, let's go through some housekeeping. The fire exits are clearly signposted. I feel like an air hostess. There's free Wi-Fi, and all the details are on posters throughout the venue. There's toilets through near the Williams Lounge and the Frank's room, which we'll be using for breakout sessions later in the day. There is a reflection space to be used throughout the day. You can come and go as you please, and there's some crafts and bits of paper and things for you to write on if you need a bit of quiet time during the day. And the JB team are also on hand to support you if you would like. There are some computers along the side of the room in the Williams Lounge where you can listen to the podcast that we're launching later on, which you'll hear more about very soon. And there is a dedicated prayer space in the building, so if you would need to use that, please head to the main reception and they'll direct you to the room. You can follow us today on social media by tweeting at Julie's Bicycle and by using the hashtag #JBClimateJustice. As you might have seen when booking your tickets, we're filming and photographing the event, and there's a live stream, so if you haven't told us that you do not want to be filmed, please speak to a member of the Julie's Bicycle team. And actually, can you all wave your hands, please? Thank you. So we've got a really packed agenda. This morning we're kicking off with a little introduction from the Julie's Bicycle director, Alison Tickell. And then we've got a keynote from the wonderful Baroness Lola Young, who will introduce our podcast, The Colour Green. And we're delighted to invite the guests from Series 1 to join us again for a chat about some of the themes that came up during the recordings. We'll have a quick break where I highly recommend you get some water and move around. It's hot, we're in a basement. Please stay hydrated. After the break, we've got a couple of separate discussion rooms. So one is on access to nature in urban spaces, and that will be happening in the Frank's room, which is just around the corner, and another on sustainable food, which will be happening in here. You will have been asked to sign up to a session when you arrived, and there are limited spaces in the Frank's room, so please try to stick to what you've signed up for. After that, we'll have lunch, and the food is all vegetarian and vegan. If you have let us know about anything specific, then your food will be separately labelled. After lunch, we've got two more panels, one on mental health and wellbeing, which will be in here, and another on global perspectives in the Frank's room. And then we've got a short break and then some time for your reflections and an amazing performance of Fog Everywhere from the Camden People's Theatre. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to our director, Alison Tickell.
I'm going to be really brief. First of all, welcome, and it's great to see you all here, and thanks very much for the welcome and to the Arts Council for helping to fund today. It's also the first day of London Climate Action Week. I don't know how many of you know that, but there's masses of things happening around London just to celebrate climate action, but also to focus on this huge issue. And the other thing is it's Julie's Bicycle's birthday this week. We are 12 years old. Amazing. So as part of that celebration, we've just got some awards tonight, which is awarding the organisations who've been really at the forefront of climate action for a long time, doing amazing things internally to change how they think, how they feel, what they do, and really bring climate and the environment into the heart of their work in all ways. So that's happening tonight. Then on Wednesday, we're launching a collaboration that we've been developing with C40 and the World Cities Culture Forum, which is bringing together cultural policy in 15 of our big global cities. Very exciting, really important piece of work. We're also welcoming 5 new team members this week, but of course today is all about the colour green. And I'm not going to talk much about this because we're going to hear from Lola in a minute, but I just want to say this is a huge labour of love. I particularly want to point out that Farah Ahmed, Yingbi Lee, who can't come because of visa, her visa hasn't allowed her to, but so she's in Singapore, but she's leading, I think she's leading the Twitter storm, isn't she? Let's hope it is a storm. And Lola and all of the artists who've given their all. I've listened to the podcast over the weekend and they're really, really exciting. We have great plans with these podcasts. This was a kind of experiment. It was a pilot and it's been outrageously successful. So we're definitely going to do some more. We can commit to that absolutely today. The TV series will follow and we're interested in an island. Thank you, Lola. If you've got ideas for artists to be part of it, tell us. If you are a funder and you're longing to support an amazing project, come and talk to me. And I'm going to leave the rest to Farah and to Lola to lead the day. And I hope that we get some really interesting debate today. But above all, once the podcasts are live, go and listen to them because they're really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. So the colour green, to give you a bit of background on what it is, it's a series of interviews hosted by Lola Young with artists and creatives of colour in the UK, out in nature, to talk about why we don't see ourselves represented in the environmental movement in the UK and generally across the global north. And it's really about challenging those perceptions of what environmentalism is and who it's for. And it's really important that we make sure that we're platforming all those voices and the projects and the activism and all of the work that is happening, not just in the UK, but around the world, because people of colour and people in the global south are at the forefront of not just the impacts of climate change, but also of the solutions. And I think that it's really, really important that we continually showcase all of those. So I'm delighted to introduce Baroness Lola Young, who is an independent crossbench member of the House of Lords, co-chair of the Foundation for Future London, and of course the brilliant host of The Colour Green. Thank you.
I know you're supposed to kind of jog onto the stage at these kinds of events, but I have to tell you I'm still a bit stiff because I've been playing football in the World Cup. Now, you may laugh, actually, but it's true, because I play for an older women's football squad. Yes, and we actually went... We went to France whilst the World Cup was on, but obviously it was a different World Cup. And so it was all great fun. But what was really interesting to me, well, lots of things were really interesting. One is that I really like working in a team, and I think that experience of working on the podcast was another example of how fruitful that can be, working with other people rather than in isolation. And the other thing was that I can't switch off from some of these issues. So I was really intrigued to find that the footballs with which we were playing were fair trade footballs. And then, of course, that started off a whole other train of thought in my mind. But I am a big football fan, and I've watched, I think, something of every single match from the Women's World Cup. And without sort of belabouring the point or going into huge detail, there is a sense in which global inequality was writ large on the pitch, in the terms of the disparities of resources and other things that are available to the different teams across the world, quite apart from the way in which women's football is regarded. Still doesn't have quite the same status as male football, which is of course reflected in the prize money and so on and so forth. Anyway, an interesting thing to observe. And we live in interesting times, of course. We sort of think, it's either the apocalyptic, oh my God, where are we going, what's happening, and what are we going to do about it, as we look forward to a new Prime Minister at some point soon. Very, very different world to the one in which I grew up. And I guess what some of us are trying to do is, that old adage, keep calm, carry on, have the occasional outburst or rant, but try to keep it mainly under control, because now we need to be better organised than we've ever been before. Those of us who think that some of the things that are going on are currently really unacceptable. As many of you, or some of you, I shouldn't presume, some of you will know that I've been doing a lot of work on modern slavery, forced labour, and those kinds of issues, particularly in supply chains. And that's one of the reasons why I was so interested in these fair trade footballs. But I've also been working on these kinds of issues in specific sectors: construction industry, fashion, of course, public bodies, this whole area around ethics, sustainability, and modern slavery. And these issues about, even the issue of the culture and education project in East London, they're all kind of interconnected for me. And I think that's really important as well, to stop kind of thinking about these things in their different silos. So these debates and discussions around activism and diversity and environmentalism have been kind of lingering around in my brain for about 30 years or so, but I've never done anything really practical about them. But Alison and I, we've been talking about this for decades. I think since the first day we met around a table where we were looking at the Observer Ethical Awards, and we're thinking, why so white? What is going on both in terms of the awards and the people judging and so on and so forth. So, this was kind of, ticking over in our minds, and every now and then we'd say, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about this? And then we had this idea about the podcasts. And I think for me that's related to a whole range of things, not just in terms of the campaigning issues that I'm interested in, but also some of the more academic, you might say, issues like history. Who gets to tell history? Who gets to shape the past and therefore inform how we act in the present and how we might be going forward? Importantly, in relation to that, it's not only about claiming history, but it's about claiming the right to voice what you think the future could be. And I think that space, as Farah has kind of indicated, is very much owned by particular sets of people who don't have that same kind of feel, empathy, imagination, creativity, that allows them to think, well, hold on a minute, let's make this much more inclusive, because there's loads of things going on that other people are doing that could help inform everybody how we're going to move past this really, really difficult moment. So for me, as with all good quality intellectual experiences and encounters, I did learn a lot from the podcast, and I wanted to ask a different set of questions towards the end of that to myself and to the other campaigners and people that I work with than I had sort of envisaged at the beginning, and I think that's a really, really good thing. So what is, in fact, if we're talking about diversity and environmental awareness raising and so on, I've had people say to me, we need to raise awareness amongst black and minority ethnic people about the impact of environmental degradation. I'm thinking, really? I think a lot of people actually know about it. That's not the same as feeling empowered to do something about it, or empowered to address it in a particular way that varies from the normal, in inverted commas, ways of dealing with it. So the questions need to be different. We need to be asking different kinds of questions. I think part of the problem is, it has to be said, that those people who've become accustomed to their advantages, accustomed to sitting in positions of privilege, find it really hard to let go. Somebody said this thing that if you're used to having 100% privilege, then if it goes down to 98%, that feels like a real loss and that you're being oppressed. And I think we can see that in some of the pronouncements of the what I think of as the Oxbridge old-timers lamenting the loss of London, for example, to foreigners and so on and so forth. A complete inability to accommodate, to think through what that actually means in terms of how we're going to work together to try and mitigate the damage and the impact, particularly around the environment, but also to do with poverty, injustices as a whole. So, when I was thinking about this, you might know that Judy Ling Wong, who's sitting down here and was one of the interviewees, was one of the founders of the Black Environmental Network. And for those of you who don't know, that was an organisation that was set up in the early 80s? 1987. So they've been at it for a long time. But I've had this interest in the environment, and I do remember this one time going to the North York's moors for a walk, which was about the same time as you were set up, actually maybe even a little bit before that. And I booked this cottage for my then boyfriend and I for a week on the phone. And when we got to the station in some little village in Yorkshire, the guy who was renting us the cottage had come to meet us. And he sort of said, "Oh, I didn't know you were going to be he literally, he didn't know. He just didn't know how to react. This strange sight, this exotic being from down south, the land of the aliens." And he then proceeded to say, "Well, we don't have any casinos here. And there aren't any nightclubs. And we had all our walking boots and sticks, properly geared up, of course." And then he said, "But we do have a Chinese takeaway." So everything was all right. But it's this kind of sense that people just don't get that, the rich diversity of humanity means something more than simply having photographs of black people or ethnic minorities, so-called, in photographs. It's about something that you live and think through all the time, and we've still got a long, long way to go with regard to that. When we were discussing how we would make the colour green, I was particularly excited by this idea of doing it out in the open all the time, even though that obviously you can't see it because it's a podcast. But there was some sort of richness that was added to the process through being out there in London, and particularly, I think, in this mega city of ours, which is both beautiful and ugly at the same time, and sort of those of us who think of ourselves as Londoners through and through, deeply, deeply attached to it and want the best for it, particularly being here at this moment in the sort of hot seat of political discourse, in this kind of absolutely how can I put it, riven with examples of pollution, it's the best and the worst of humanity all kind of wrapped up in this wonderful city. And being out there talking about environmental degradation when you got, like the 853 from Heathrow going out to New York, and you're trying to accommodate that, it just gives that kind of depth to the discussion. And we didn't try to ignore any of the ambient sounds around, which were many and various, from bird song to lawnmowers and aeroplanes and trains and what have you. But that is part of the richness of the city, and I think we need to acknowledge that and not kind of try and reject that as being somehow anti-nature. That's another word that we need to really seriously deconstruct, this whole thing around nature and what is natural and so on. So, earlier in my youth, again, I was a big fan of the golden age of science fiction, and I talked a little bit earlier about this thing about the future, who owns the future. And in that golden age of science fiction from, I guess, 40s, 50s, 60s, and maybe a little bit into the 70s, whether it was literature or film or television, none of the futures envisaged really involved, well, black people certainly, people of colour weren't, obviously had all been obliterated by the time the future came, as it was envisaged then, because we weren't anywhere to be seen. But women were hardly to be seen as well, because obviously it was all technical and scientific, and women's brains couldn't quite accommodate all of that. So, much as I enjoyed reading all of that stuff, there were these questions in my head about what is going on here. Why aren't we seen as having a future for ourselves? But Amma, one of our interviewees, is she's speculative fiction. And I think that's really, really interesting, because then it's about imagining different kinds of futures that have been shaped by a different notion of what went on in history, and therefore a different sense of what the possibilities are. And I think that's a really important thing to be taking on board. Of course, there are now, especially, a whole sort of wave of, it's often referred to as Afrofuturism, which is a thing now. And you can see examples of that in lots of places, from Black Panther to Get Out and so on and so forth. But there's a really kind of interesting way of thinking through what are the possibilities, what is it that we can do, how can we interact in different ways that haven't been envisaged before, because these kind of, they've all been promoted, if you like, all been proposed and created by a very narrow group of people. So, how am I doing for time, Farah? Yeah, okay, right. So I said earlier that I was involved in looking at modern slavery and trafficking and forced labour and all of that stuff. And the high-risk industries for that would be garment industry, agricultural sector, fishing, construction, extractive industries, and so on. And coincidentally or not, they're also the high-risk industries for pollution, environmental degradation, deforestation, etc., etc. So it seems to me there is this kind of structural link between the two, and that's another area that I think Alice and I are kind of looking at, or has been seeded in our minds, as to how is it possible to think through some of these huge problems. The estimate is that there are 40.5 million people enslaved in one way or another in the world today. And that is incredible and awful, but it's related also to this big environmental piece. So to me, trying to look at the two together is really important, and seeing how they're intertwined. I'm not going to go into detail now because I'm at the start of thinking about that, but I will flag up the work of Professor Kevin Bales from the Nottingham University Rights Lab, where I've got an association, who's written about this. And it is really interesting and important, because what he says is if you could bring down the activities of the criminals involved in modern slavery, you would also cut CO2 emissions. It's a very interesting set of arguments around that. It's also important because there's that whole piece around migrants. And as some of you will know, historically, the environmental movement, particularly in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century, has not always been exactly, shall we say, kind in terms of the way it's viewed indigenous peoples, where the land is at stake, or where it's involved notions of eugenics, which kind of cuts across some of those early environmentalist activity and discourse. And some of that does carry over to today. We're still a bit stuck in that groove, or some people are. So, and again, it sort of relates to me to what I was thinking about the African countries that were involved in the Women's World Cup and the kinds of things they've had to deal with in order to get to that stage, compared to the Europeans, the Americans, and from the Antipodes. But, you know, this kind of third world expression, this population explosion, these images of Indian and African slums, children with distended stomachs, all of that imagery, which is still deeply embedded in the way in which some of our NGOs see those people. And there's also lurking within that this idea that these hordes are responsible, because who made all the pollution in the world? It's China, it's India, it's all of these. You know, it's this huge population growth amongst those countries that are making a bad situation even worse. And again, I think we really have to look to ourselves, look at the evidence, think through what is being said when those kinds of statements are being made. Another issue that has been flagged up in some of the reading that I've done about the contemporary environmental movement is that it tends to kind of universalize in a way that isn't terribly helpful. So it's almost as if everybody is equally affected by the impact of the environment. And we know that that's not true. And so any kind of remedies, any kind of action that we need to take has to be based on the recognition of who is impacted most. Again, Farah pointed out earlier that it's not just about the impact, it's about who's doing the heavy lifting around this subject, because they have to, because it's a matter for daily life. And in a conversation with Judy at Myatt's Fields Park, I have to say, I'm such a North Londoner, I can't even pronounce these words in South London. Myatt's Fields Park, that was a really interesting setting as well. I was introduced to parts of London I'd not been to before in the course of this, which was in itself an education. But Judy, very insightfully as usual, sort of pointed to the fact that if you're sitting watching television, images of floods and people dying and what have you, for those for whom some of those people will be relatives of people who live here, or if not direct relatives, they'll be from communities that people know. So what is the impact on them? How is that related to the way that they feel about environmental degradation and what kinds of actions they can take? And I think, again, it's an area of work that people haven't really looked at. And also, I see the diasporas from all of those different, whether it's from African countries, Asian countries, or wherever, all those diaspora peoples have a sort of sense of connection at some level or another with those countries, many of which are the most badly affected by what's happening with the environment. How can we tap into that? How are those people thinking that through? And again, that's part of what for me was really emerging. It's a very interesting thread from the podcast. So I think, if you're a music creative like Kareem, talking about homelessness and a way of addressing the lack of affordable social housing in London, or any kind of housing that's affordable in London, how do you address that as a musician? Well, listen to the podcast and you'll find out. Very interesting and very different way of working, which comes from a particular sensibility and a particular set of feelings around what is possible using creativity. So, all in all, I would say there's a really big struggle on to try and fully understand how race, in inverted commas, ethnicity, poverty, social and economic injustice, understanding that is an absolutely necessary and fundamental step towards combating environmental disparity. We're used to talking about disparity, I'm used to talking about disparity in the context of the criminal justice system, but there's a real environmental disparity here. When we were in Lewisham, I think it was, the one that was occupied, the gardens that were occupied by members of the local community, and Zena Edwards there, and we were talking this through and sort of thinking about, there's lots of pockets of activism that are going on, but how are they reflected anywhere? They're not really reflected anywhere. And there's this terrible disparity because that, if there's a school on a roundabout, traffic roundabout, where you've got 15 different buses and loads of taxis and cars and motorbikes all spewing their stuff, and those kids from that school are playing in the playground and inhaling and absorbing all of that. That doesn't really happen in Hampstead, but it will happen in Tottenham. So, there's a real kind of an environmental premium for some people and deeply embedded in environmental disparity for others. So we've got to work in this horrible word, I think. Well, it's not that it's horrible, but it's slightly ugly, intersectionality. But it does kind of sum up, all these different things that are going on that are all interlinked. And I know it's really hard trying to think holistically, because you get in such a tangle and think, oh my God, I can't tackle everything all at once. And I don't think it's about that. I don't think it is about trying to tackle everything all at once. But unless you're aware of what part of the system is causing X, you can't really address Y, because they're all interlinked in the end, that whole suite, as far as I'm concerned. And just to say that the use of the term diversity, I use it all the time myself, and I hate myself every time I use it. It's like using the word black and ethnic minority, BAME, or funny tinged. Maybe we should adopt the term funny tinged. We should call ourselves the funny tinge crew. But, all of those terms which are sort of policy terms that become misinterpreted and used in all kinds of weird ways. So lack of diversity, I'm not even sure what that even means now. But as I said earlier, it can become a little bit of a fig leaf for disguising the fact that we've kind of accepted inequality, and all we need to do is to bolt on little bits of people in photographs and mention the whole suite of socially protected characteristics in order to allay our consciences. Right, so thinking about all those people who've given their time so generously for the podcast, because it took quite a lot of time, and walking. People who know me know I'm an obsessive walker, so I drag people around everywhere. So we walked all over these parks, having our conversations, and then sitting down in rain or shine, cold and warm, to have these debates and discussions. And people have been very generous with their time and with their experiences. And I think, again, just reiterate that there's really a much better way than the environmental movement as a whole has currently got of engaging with a wider range of people. We need to redefine what environmental activism is. And I think that linking it to creativity and the world of the imagination is a really, really good way of doing that, because that's what fires people up. It gets people to act. It gets people, the arts and creativity are what gets people to think in different ways and to ask different kinds of questions. So I think that's really, really important. I mentioned Judy earlier, and you'll be hearing from her shortly, but in this park, which is really incredibly impressive, 60,000 plants a year are grown by Trees, who's a volunteer in the park. And what Judy said was, Trees grows 60,000 plants a year and gives them to local people. Peppers, tomatoes, squash, beans, peas, herbs, all grown from seed and planted up in discarded plastic bags, old cardboard boxes. He distributes them to those who don't call in. And as he doesn't drive, this means taking the plants around the borough in a wheelbarrow. Food brings nature close to people. It's what people need in urban areas. Food, everything you eat is living, and if you are the one who grows the food, you really enter this terrific living cycle and realise you are nature. This is how everything starts. The rest, about enjoying the beauty of nature, that is privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lola. I am going to rethink the Twitter handle to a funny tinge crew. I'm going to invite the podcast Series 1 interviewees up onto the stage. That's Anna Josephine Budge, Zena Edwards, Kareem Days, and Judy Ling Wong. So just over here. And while you're getting settled, I just want to take a moment to talk about the legacy of this project. So part of the beauty of the podcast is that they are all recorded outdoors in our favourite spaces in nature, with birdsong and a lot of airplanes.
Sorry, we're just having a crash here.
There we go. And this means that we are, of course, a little bit limited in the spaces that we can record and how many of the amazing creatives of colour doing climate justice work we can platform and we can reach. So alongside that this morning, we're also launching a Twitter handle, the @the_colourgreen, where we're going to be inviting somebody new to take over every week. So that's starting next Monday, where we're going to be handing over to Yingbi Lee, who is one of the producers of our podcast, and she's going to be talking about her context in Singapore, where she is at the moment. So she is going to be doing all of that for next week. And if you would like to be involved, if you want to take over for a week, if you want to talk about the work that you do and the context that you're in, please get in touch. I'm here all day. So thank you very much. And over to you again, Lola.
Thank you very much. Sorry, just getting sorted with water and everything. And I'm so delighted to have everybody back again. But I think, is this the first time you've all been together in the one space?
Yes.
And did you know each other beforehand? Did you meet each other? Okay, great. So I think what we'll do just very quickly, if you wouldn't mind doing a very quick introduction to yourself and maybe one line about what you thought the colour green was going to be about and whether it fulfilled your expectations. You don't have to say yes. It'd be nice if you did. But Judy, do you want to start?
I'm Judy Ling Wong. I'm president of the Black Environment Network and also a founding trustee of London Natural Park City. I think the colour green is really wonderful because, we have arrived, but the news has not got out. And this is about pushing out the fact that we're not all that lost. We know what's happening. We have activists in our community, and somehow it doesn't make the news. So we have got to get this awareness out so that we increasingly encourage everybody to see that we can all do this. That is what it's all about for me.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Zena Edwards. I'm a poet, artist, artist activist, project developer, and I was asked to be part of the podcast because of the work that I've done with young people and helping them raising awareness with them so that they can continue to raise awareness around climate issues. And I think this is really important as well, mainly for, exactly for the same reasons you said. People have been around greening their communities and are considered community workers as opposed to activists. And I think it's really about changing the perspective of what an activist looks like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Kareem.
Hi, my name is Kareem. I was asked to do it because with my band, United Vibrations, we set up a community land trust in South London to build some houses, sustainable houses. I didn't really know what I expected for the podcast. I just came with an open mind. We just had a good conversation. I think dialogue's one of the most important things, or if not the most important thing moving forward. We just had a great conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm Amma Josephine Budge. I'm a writer. I write science fiction speculatively. I'm also a curator and a climate colonialism researcher. And I suppose I similarly came with an open mind, and I was mostly just really excited that the conversation was happening. In a forum that was likely to be communicated to people who weren't already converted, because as everybody has said, people have been doing this work, and some of us are talking to each other. We're not all talking to each other, and that needs to happen more. So I suppose it's a really great start, but there's so many more conversations that I think need to happen, and hopefully it's just generating the movement, keeping it flowing.
Excellent. Well, clearly Alison has plans for world domination, given her opening remarks, which I think would be a good thing. Right, so Judy, can I ask you, when we talked, you talked quite a bit about the feeling of disconnection and loneliness, particularly when you came here from, because I think you were quite young, weren't you? You were travelling when you were quite young from Hong Kong to Australia and then to the UK. And then, but Amma had almost the opposite experience of moving between urban and rural spaces in the UK before moving to Ghana as a child. So, to both of you, I guess, how do you navigate these kind of shifting spaces, particularly when you're quite young? How do you manage to kind of insert yourself and feel that you belong somewhere, or did you not? Don't know. Who would like to start? Judy, would you? Judith.
It was a very difficult time. I mean, when I was 15 and I left Hong Kong, under circumstances, sometimes when you talk to people and they say, where have you been, and, the trajectory of your life, and you speak briefly about being born in Hong Kong and then going to Australia to go to school at age 15 and then coming to Europe and so on. The first thing that comes into your mind, they think it's a very glamorous thing. They think it's like, you travel, you must be really rich and so on. Actually, it was a series of displacements. So I was displaced from a very Chinese culture all by myself, because when my father got enough money and he was ambitious for his children and so on, he actually, when I was 14, said to me, Judy, would you like to go to school in Australia? And then he said, of course, you realize that once you go, you don't come back, because there's enough money to go to school, but never enough money to come home for holidays. So once you're gone, you're sort of gone. So I was rattling around in Australia all on my own since I was 15. When people went home in school holidays, I went to a youth hostel all by myself and was wandering around. And you can imagine being such a young person in formative years and so on. That was the beginning of my journey to sort out who I was. Because I had tremendous culture shock. I became very depressed and very lonely, and it was unspeakable because there's no family to talk to. So as a young person, you're talking to yourself. The people around you don't know what on earth you are about if you say something like that. So that was a journey of displacement and disorientation, which took many, many years. I don't think I would say I became a sort of beginning to be a balanced person till I was in my mid-30s when I look back. But all that has fed into my awareness of what displacement actually means and how that displacement continues in these scenarios of education. You can imagine a small child from an ethnic minority family and usually speaking their own language till the point they go to school because the parents are struggling with English anyway, so they speak to their children in their own language. It repeats itself, that small child arriving at nursery, school, and so on, into a strange country. The culture of the family, a miniature culture of the greater culture they came from, displaced into British education. There's a shock at such a young age. I often talk about this because we relive this in all sorts of ways as ethnic minority communities, even when we have arrived here as so-called British citizens.
That's really interesting, and I hope we can come back to that, because clearly those experiences do shape your life. Are there elements of that you recognise, Amma, or was it entirely different for you?
I had a very different experience of moving, largely because I moved with my mother from here to Ghana at the age of 9. So it was very different moving with her, but I completely relate to the culture shock and it really reverberating throughout your whole system and questioning who you are, what you are, why you are. I think all those were questions that I was really grappling with at that age. And my displacement was very much a racial displacement because I'm mixed race. I traveled with my white mother to Ghana and suddenly was viewed by Ghanaians as a white person, obviously having come from Britain where I'm not a white person, and then having to deal with the class dynamics, the shade dynamics of being privileged, having a British passport, being able to leave when a lot of young people in Ghana, at that time I think it's changing, the big objective was to leave, it was to get to Europe and America, and I had this kind of magical ability in my passport and I really didn't want to be there. It wasn't really until I went back as an adult, I think, that I started to work through the complexities of that, because to really deal with what you're basically dealing with is a history of colonization, a very direct colonization when you're British Ghanaian, as a 9-year-old was really difficult to comprehend, especially because my main source of contact was my mother, who was white and didn't understand. And couldn't understand, and so that was very complicated, and I think there was a huge economic shift because we were not very rich, but were at an international school where the students were incredibly rich, and I was there because my mum taught there, and so I kind of got in, but there was a humongous disparity of people living in huge glass houses. I remember a friend of mine had her Barbies in a glass case and you couldn't touch them. And that was the kind of element of bizarreness, I think, for me, compared to we were living in a one-room house in a bungalow with 7 other families, or we shared a bathroom, about 40 of us, And then I would go to school in this strange world. And we were really quite well off in our neighbourhood, actually. And so that kind of understanding of poverty, basically, was really important. And I think even though it was very challenging for me, I absolutely wouldn't give it up, those experiences, because I mean, not only has it helped me understand who I am as an African, it gives me a feeling of rootedness and homeness when I go back, which I definitely wouldn't have had, especially as a mixed race person if I hadn't lived there. But also a sense of, it's galvanized my, I guess, passion and dedication to working in climate colonialism and not being able to run away from the realities of what's happening across the world, but particularly in my home, when my family's villages are under sand and the places where my dad used to play, those coastlines have been eroded. The beaches that I used to play on that used to be 100-foot beaches are now 10-foot beaches, and it's a really bizarre, terrifying, but lived experience, which I think is really different from just being here and it all kind of happening over there in the news. And all the bias of the news is really different. And it's really different because also I know people are there doing things, which also changes the narrative of we have to go over there and save them because they're ignorant and they don't know what climate change is, which it continues in all spaces that I go into. And that's really, really helpful and humbling. But I mean, really hard for a 9-year-old, I would say.
And indeed for a 15-year-old.
Absolutely.
And whatever any of us have experienced with regard to that, whether it's implicit or explicit, that colonial mentality that we've all encountered in different ways. But a couple of you in the recordings talked about the role of faith, or maybe not in an organised religion sort of way necessarily, but perhaps around spirituality. And I think, Zena, you said something like you prayed that your voice would return when you lost it on stage. And Kareem, you mentioned your family gave you a humanist but spiritual kind of footing in life. And of course, we visited you. We went to see you in your dad's house, which was an amazing experience. And I hope we'll have time to talk about that. But if not, it's on the podcast, because that was quite extraordinary. But could each of you perhaps say a little bit about that? Because I do think the issue of faith, spirituality, relationships with nature, etc., although they've sometimes been co-opted into the kind of primitivist way of talking about people of colour, how do you see that as impacting upon what you think about environmental issues? Kareem, would you like to kick off?
It's hard to explain. I mean, I'm not part of any organised religion. I think I'm probably like the mainstream kind of atheist, scientific kind of, but I think I've learned to really appreciate kind of religion, spirituality, because I think it's very easy to be the kind of like religion's evil kind of school of thought. But I think when we spoke it in the podcast, I mentioned Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement. And he's a fantastic novelist, and he does like a linguistic comparison of like the Paris Agreement and the famous thing the Pope writes about climate change. And he was like, the encyclical was like way further ahead. Like, and if you look at any kind of activism, particularly in America, the role of the church is, you kind of underestimate how important it is as an institution of bringing people together. And I think whether you like, I mean, I get the criticisms. I'm not saying it's all good, but in terms of like when you're going through hard times, and the work I do now in my own community, you know, what I see people who are of faith and in the church doing, I would never say a bad word about someone going to church or religion, and I totally, I think it's amazing. And yeah, my own spiritual belief, I'm open, you know, I'm not closed to anything, and I think it comes to optimism. I think faith and religion, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not going to get into that, but I think the hope of like humanity as an optimistic kind, as to what we can be collectively. And I think ultimately racism and identity, for me, in terms of the positive alternative to instead of a racial hierarchy, is a kind of universal humanism where everyone's, you know, of the same value. And I think that's what we're aiming for. We're not there, obviously, but you have to have you have to be able to believe in that as an idea to even begin the work. You know,
Absolutely.
like I mentioned with the Rebecca Solnit book, what's the Hope in the Darkness or something. We talk about the science of hope and how in any movement it's crucial to bring people together. We can't be operating on the whole Smith, we're a virus kind of mentality, which I think the scientific community does, even people like Attenborough. And I think ultimately, economically, we live in a Malthusian world, and ultimately, my thing, as I mentioned in the podcast, is that the reason why they're quite willing not to do anything is because, at the end of the day, black and brown people don't count. And ultimately, they're the ones who are going to die in the hundreds of millions. And I think if you apply a Malthusian or even utilitarian approach, it's like, well, so what? We're just going to change our crops. People in West Africa will die. They don't care. So, and you know, the whole overpopulation kind of angle. So I'm going off track now, but that's
it's all part of it.
I'll pass it on.
No, go, because it is all part of it.
Yeah, well, the point is positivity, hope, and belief in kind of universal humanism. We are all kind of one and related. I guess going to your point about identity, the whole black and white thing, I feel like to hear the voice of, you know, like in my family, my dad's as black as you are, my mum is as white, as ginger, I'm in between, my brothers, we're all different colours, but I feel like in the debate, it's always them and us. We don't look at people and say, like, that could be my mum, my brother, my dad, my sister, you know, it's very much like the other.
Yeah.
So, yeah, anyway.
Totally. I mean, I'm with you about this thing about hope because, you know, people often say, oh, young people, they're idealists, they'll grow out of it. And I think, well, I hope not, because actually if you don't have something, because idealism is about hope, I hope that things can improve and get better for more people. And therefore, if you don't have that, it's, you know, the phrase of Barack Obama, for all his faults, you know, the audacity of hope is really audacious, isn't it? To think that things can be improved. Zena, what about you? How do you approach this, and would you say that sort of some kind of spiritual connection is fundamental to your activism? Or?
Definitely. Please excuse me, I'm actually making notes on my phone. I'm not doing the social media thing. I would take a picture of you all and then post it, and that's when I'll be doing the social media thing. I think there's definite spiritual connection. I mean, look, the planet is a living thing. We've got organisms crawling all over and living off of us, and they're, you know, dealing with their own kind of hurricanes and earthquakes that we're doing. So the planet is a living thing. It's got its own cycles and rhythms, etc. And if it really gets, can I swear? Pissed off, it will just shake us off. We're bugs on a rock, okay? So I think if we're going to think about this, a spiritual connection, I think it's about having gratitude and grace, being gracious about how it provides for us. And this isn't even about being, you know, all hippie or anything. It's just giving thanks, because, and that's what Indigenous communities always do. They always give thanks. They have rituals for when the crops are coming in, if there's so the floods don't happen, etc. So there's a spiritual connection that we could all actually tune into. And the one thing that I kind of picked up on one time when I was doing another thing around, I was part of the movement for the Human Zoo, with Brett Bailey, the Human Zoo. I don't know if people remember that theatre piece. And I made this whole film called Racism in the UK Arts. Perception, Power, and something else. I can't remember. I made it in 2014. And I found out about a term called resourcism. And resourcism is where people themselves who are on a land actually are a resource in their own right as well. But it's actually rooted in the whole concept, a Christian concept mainly, of the Garden of Eden, that we're all keepers of the Garden of Eden, but actually there are folks who have more right to use the garden, in which case resourcism comes into play, and Indigenous folk are just a resource, and they don't necessarily have to be considered. I mean, it was in 1969, I think, Australian Aboriginals were stopped being considered flora and fauna. In terms of there being a spirituality, I think I'm looking at the younger generations now, and like they're really into things like witchism, witchiness. Paganism is a new thing, which is a connection to the earth as well. They're into crystals, and crystals have an energy. They've been around for millions of years. Crystals come about. They almost hold like a blueprint for the earth itself in terms of its development as a living thing that was evolving. Crystals came about and they have different energies, and they've got a blueprint of the earth's growth in it, and they've got something that they can inform us with, and they inform us through our bodies because we are sensual, sentient beings. So in terms of a spirituality, I think I'm a bit freaked out by forests. And that's not because I'm frightened of somebody jumping out from behind them. I just feel like I'm being watched the whole time, because spirits are, because trees are alive, they're living things. We all know that there's interconnected networks that are happening underneath the earth. So there's an intelligence there that the earth has to offer us. And if you want to call that, tuning into that, a spiritual path, then do that, But I think there's a definite spiritual aspect that can be considered when it comes to doing climate justice work as well. Because I think we have to think holistically about how we are in some symbiosis with the planet. If people believe in astrology, we've got Mercury retrograde happening right about now, and that only means that the planet Mercury is at the closest it will ever be in its terms of its cycle, which means it has effect on all like electrical devices and our communication and stuff like that. Now, it just so happens that seems to be real. That happens. Electrical devices go down, etc., because the planet is a part of a universe. It's part of a solar system. So it's all interconnected. We cannot separate spirituality, as far as I'm concerned. Science and spirituality are connected anyway.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because the language, we always come to this kind of stumbling blocks, potentially, around language. And, to a huge extent, all of you are like wordsmiths in as much as you're artists. You have languages, whether that's visual, whether it's musical, or whether it's writing, or whatever it is. It's all about language and communication. And sometimes, like you were talking, Kareem, about, the rational scientist who on paper might be diametrically opposed to the animism and paganism and all of that stuff. And it's that, so is it a question of art and creativity perhaps being able to give a language to all of these different competing discourses? Is it a possibility that the arts in some way, particularly you as all of you as artists, can contribute to a different way of articulating this that can bring more people together as opposed to dividing?
Yes, I think that we give too much to words, which feeds rationality. And I think art in all its mediums make us go towards wordlessness. The values that comes with other things beyond wordlessness is so beautiful. And I think back to my own beginnings as a child in Hong Kong at the time when it was not this glitzy place, but more like ancient China, where I was fed by the floating atmospheres of perception around me. Sometimes it comes into words, but people tell you things which are really more about a wordlessness experience and recognizing the aliveness of things. For example, I remember when I was very upset once when I was a little girl, when I was probably about 7 years old. I sort of dropped a bowl and it broke. And when I look upon it, it was very extraordinary because my mother just said to me, "Oh, that's just the end of his life." She actually said, "Don't worry about it. If you had not dropped it, if this is supposed to be the moment of his end of his life, it would have cracked on its own and come to an end." Because she says everything is alive. And this concept of everything alive, not defined by scientists, and whether it's alive because it moves around or it grows and so on. The things that we call inanimate, she called alive. Rocks are alive and so on. And she described the life of a rock, how You know, when it breaks up in the sea, it becomes something else, and becomes sand, and becomes this and that. It has a life traveling through time. And I think these things of consciousness and so on, about things being alive. I used to ask my mother, well, how is a rock alive then? I mean, she says it's alive because it's conscious, it's a rock. Then that's why it is rock. And that how it comes that it can be a rock because it's conscious of being a rock. It's organizing itself as a rock. That is aliveness and consciousness. It's conscious that it's brown, and therefore it is brown. It organizes itself around its brown identity and becomes a brown rock, not a white rock. And all these things, I think, takes us beyond the control of rationality into an expanded view of how and why we do things. And not to say that everything we do, we have to have a reason why we do it, instead of a sense. So people talk about the beginnings of religion and explaining everything and so on. But because we live within a living world and we feel this power. You know, when we feel the power of something, and all these words are very Western, like worshipping and religion and so on. You know, in the West they will ask you, do you have a religion? In the East, we don't have that sort of question. We ask, whose teachings do you follow? Yeah, so if you're a Buddhist, you follow the teachings of the Buddha. But it's personal. You don't adore something. You might venerate the Buddha. You don't adore him. You don't worship him. But you follow the teachings, and you're on a journey. So in the East, very often people would tell you, everyone is on a journey. And there's a consciousness of being on a journey that you yourself define. Because I grew up in an area before Buddhism was so strong in Hong Kong, and this sense of, again, labeling, the Chinese have 30,000 gods or something like that. But they're not gods. They're centers of power that you sense within the spectrum of aliveness. And you relate to that. And a lot of Western scholars became very frustrated when they study Hinduism or Buddhism and so on, because it is so fluid. Everyone is defining it themselves. And in China, in that more ancientness, if you didn't like all the gods and so on that you call gods or powers or that exist, well, you go and create your own. You add to the numbers, because you sense that power is approached to yourself. So I think that there's a sense of sacredness and awe and identification with this continuity of power, which you can access when you relate to it, is for me what is important in all this.
Oh, okay. So again, we're trying to grapple with really complicated, complex ideas in a very short space of time. And I think, this is a dialogue that will continue because, we talk about the difficulty of words, but that's kind of what we have. You deal in words, Amma. How do you convey some of these things? How do you get your ideas across, particularly in relation to this, what we're broadly speaking calling environmental activism and awareness?
I think I'm very lucky because I write science fiction, and the joy, the great privilege of writing what we call science fiction, I call it speculative writing, is that words are your tool, but they're not the goal. And it's really about, it is really about transporting someone into that space of wordlessness where, because it's not real, people have permission to feel whatever is going on, and for there not to be a right or wrong answer. I think in my stories, if I give someone that itch that makes them go, oh, what, I'm thinking about it the next day, I have some weird dreams, something has been dislodged or dislocated or repositioned within my consciousness through that kind of medium which has taken me into a different place. And I think that's very much, so at the moment a lot of the work that I'm working on across interdisciplinarily is about trying to reposition the human as to dislocate the hierarchies of humanness, this species that we inhabit that supposedly is superior. And I do that through pleasure and erotics, but also through writing a lot about what an end or many different endings to our kind of dominant reign, which is Western white cis het patriarchal man's dominant anthropocenic ecological economic reign, what that might look like and mean, and for us to become increasingly comfortable with that ending. And I'm not talking about the extinction of all human life, but I'm talking about the end of all human life as we currently experience it here in the West, and to become comfortable with that, for that to be okay, outside of the kind of Hollywood dynamic of, you know, suddenly we've all got to fight all of animalness. You know, we've got to fight everything that isn't us. The whole, you know, kind of Planet of the Apes idea, which, I mean, I sobbed in Planet of the Apes because I was the first one, not the original first one, but the new first one. And I was like, this is what you have left. This is your conclusion, is that there's going to be some kind of human apocalypse, not a world apocalypse, at the end of which humans will have to fight all other life and obliterate it yet again. And I think it's how do we become comfortable with the fact that maybe the next cycle of all that is, the next cycle of our own matter, because that's what we are, liquid, solid, supposedly solid, you know, bits of bone, the bits of rock that are in us, when we get ground down and turned into other things, how do we become okay with that? How does that become a source of honoring? And what do we think about the composite particles of our bone matter, and whether or not they're going to be composite particles that are about humility and love and compassion and justice, or whether or not they're going to be about selfishness and fear and jealousy and isolation, because really that's the composite mass of many of us at the moment. And so really I use my science fiction to get us to kind of think about fighting for our own matter, this matter, but also this matter, these are live things, and what that can all be transformed into being, and that not being the end of man, the worst thing ever, which is really the end of patriarchy, which is its worst nightmare, and how we think about that being the goal of a lifetime.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, if you look at that, I always have to watch those kinds of apocalyptic visions in two different ways. One is, as you say, with all of that analysis, but the other is, oh God, it's so exciting. These are because they're very comforting stories, aren't they? Because they tell us that it'll all be all right. Humans are the most important species on the planet. And actually, you know, the end of humans is like the end of the world, whereas we know obviously it isn't, but, you know, we just don't like to think that, and that's kind of an important intervention. I'm conscious of time, and we do want to open it out to the audience for a few things, but I just wanted to ask you, Corinne, particularly, because you don't deal with words in quite the same way. I mean, because as a musician, I just wondered if you could just briefly say something about how you've connected, because I just think it's a really fascinating model, if you want to talk about it, how you connected your music.
It's an interesting time to ask me this question, because I've kind of been on a journey of like being fully invested in music, then through being obsessed with changing the world, getting out of music into that, and then kind of looking back at music and thinking music's a waste of time, to now just remembering, actually, no, hang on a minute, music's amazing. Like it's maybe one of the most powerful tools we have. So I've kind of gone from both sides of like kind of being fully invested in music as a tool for change, and then not, and now realizing actually it's a crucial part of the puzzle. So it's a lot to sum up, but I mean the birth of my son is actually what kind of brought me back to it, and I don't know if loads of you will have gone through it or experienced it in some way, and it's about, basically I'm gonna cut a long story short, but it's about oxytocin, which is the love hormone, and in terms of like being able to, your environment basically fundamentally affects your mood and where you are. Basically, oxytocin is what you need to have the contractions and give birth. And if adrenaline comes in, it stops, and it's not what you want. So, but basically, music was what got us through, and it just got me thinking about other parts of life in terms of like sound, scent, touch. All these things kind of affect how you feel. And I think we live in a society which is so amped up on stress, cortisol, kind of fear, we're constantly in a kind of fight or flight mode. And actually music's one of those things which can just kind of like wash all that away, bring you back to a place, feel grounded, and a place where you feel safe, warm, comfortable, loving. And then I think from that place, you're more likely to act with all the positive aspects of humanity, which Amma explained. We're more likely to act in that way if we're not fearing for our lives, basically. And music is one of those things which can do that. And maybe it's the thing which does separate us from other aspects of the animal kingdom in terms of we can consciously. Well, I don't know. Maybe I won't. We're not special. We're not special.
We're going to go deep now.
But I think being able to organise ourselves, come together, and act of playing music. And I think actually, if you look at the music industry, and this is my critical side, if you look at the music industry and how it's structured and how it operates, it's not. A lot of musicians are about that, and it is in there, but that's the fringe. Like the mainstream music is not. The mainstream music is about commoditizing what you've got for profit, and it's about alcohol, drugs, getting excited, sex, which is not bad. I'm not criticizing. That stuff is all good. Like we need all that stuff too, but there is this other aspect of music which, you know, other artists, I mean, like one of the artists we listened to when we was giving birth was like Ravi Shankar. I don't know, we listened to some Arvo Part, which is like this spiritual kind of like meditative music, or even someone like Bob Marley. I think that someone like Bob Marley is amazing because you can dance and like upbeat and have a good time, but ultimately it's a calming, peaceful energy which like actually, and his own story, like bringing peace to his nation, you know, it's like that's the power music has.
I'd like to respond, please.
Yes, please do.
I want to talk about the arts though directly in terms of, you know, climate, social justice and climate justice, because for me as a writer, I'm a poet, so for me poetry are almost like spells. You can put disparate words together that wouldn't normally make sense, but suddenly they do, for some reason they do make sense as a poem, because you actually end up tapping into a part of the brain that does the visualizing, that is the imagination. The brain automatically wants to make meaning out of a sequence of words. It just does that. So if you are, you know, as a magician writer, you can actually conjure up in spaces, you can conjure up spaces in the brain in terms of like images and senses. Also, it's been really interesting talking about the body a lot. As a performance poet, I like to use my voice as an instrument as well to actually, you know, encourage people to say, it's okay, I'm a poet, I might come and talk to you, but don't be upset, you can trust me. You know, I'm aware that the voice, the human voice, actually can conjure energy in a room as well. There's also, from a music perspective, Sufi Inyat Khan has a book called Music, and he talks about the different tones and how they actually resonate different parts of the body. So for me, if you want to work in a particular way, using the voice, using the musicality of the voice, using words as well, you can actually impact people. You can actually touch their humanity and impact people. You do that in the right way, then your campaign is going to have some kind of impact and resonance in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do it by writing good copy for an advertising campaign or something like that. The other thing I wanted to mention very quickly is that we have to look at the way the arts, you know, it's really interesting, even this whole setup here, you know, there's a stage and there's us on the stage. You know, the stages that kind of fourth wall, the arts are supposed to be consumed. You know, unfortunately, that's the way it is. The arts are meant to be consumed. So if they're meant to be consumed, how are they nourishing? How are they informing you if they're going to do that? But if you are going to look at it from a very commercialized and consumeristic perspective, that's going to really go against the kind of idea of creating something that's really humanist. You know, commercialization ends up dehumanizing most of the time. You know, you're just a digit that pays money for this product to get for profit, you know. So how can you rehumanize the person who you're actually trying to get on board onto your campaign? How are you not talking at them? How are you including them? you know, in the actual campaign as well. How they can feel that they're interacting and be a part of it. And the arts does that. It's a complete leveler. You know, when I do my work, I might do collage with them, with the young people, art journaling. So they don't have to use words, even though I'm a poet. I don't force them to use words. I'm just saying, use your eyes visually, poetically, and then write, and then create what it is you want to create, and then write any words that come. You know, so give them an access point. The access point is through the arts.
Okay, it's such a shame we have we've only got 5 minutes left, I'm just informed. So, but actually, you know, I'm really pleased to hear you all out, because I think it's just a fascinating combination coming from so many different perspectives, and I think that's a really big point to make, this sort of homogenizing tendency. So all BAME people think the same, have the same needs, have the same levels of awareness and activism and what have you. And that's the problem with all of those policy markers, is that they don't kind of differentiate. And I think that's a really important thing, one of the many fascinating things that's come out of that discussion. I think so we get time for maybe 1 or 2 comments, questions, providing they're brief, I think. So, and there's a microphone to travel round. So is there somebody with a hand up? Oh, yeah. Oh, you've got your hand up because you've got the microphone. All right.
I can talk if you want.
Okay, so... Yeah, okay, so anybody like to say anything? I'm sorry it's such a short amount of time in which to speak. But any kind of...
But like Dina said, do you feel included? Like the stress of asking, especially the first question, can just be anything that comes.
It doesn't even have to be a question, it can be just a word, a sequence of words. Oh, okay, here we go. Boom. Julian, and then... Okay.
I just really want to say thank you very much, because I think when we see the images of what's going on in the planet, it does raise this huge fear, and I feel like a rabbit staring into the headlights when I think of the scale of the catastrophe. And here I do just feel a real sense of hope. I feel a sense of calm. I feel a sense of centeredness. And I think that if we are to get humanity as a whole, to think as one human family, we need to be galvanizing and utilizing exactly the conversations that we've been hearing today about the beautiful complexity of humanity and what we'll lose if we don't get our act together. And I suppose the question would be, in terms of places of power and the institutionalized response to climate change, has anybody got any either encouraging or discouraging things to share in terms of reactions people have had to the idea of the arts and formal political power working together?
Okay, I'm going to take the second question and then we'll come back to both of us, please.
Hello. Oh, it was me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm with Colourful Radio, and it's been a fantastic event so far. I just wanted to just kind of put it out there as an observation, maybe more than a question, but it's like pushing back a little bit on what Baroness Lola, you had said earlier about the fact that this subject is being talked about amongst many different communities of different colour. I'm wondering at what level it's being talked about and how we can make sure that it's being spread across the whole of the community. For instance, I talk about it a lot, but normally the people who talk about it with me are normally sounding very middle-class English, which, like all of you sitting up there, you talked about being from all different countries, but all sounded very middle-class English. So I guess the question is, how can we make sure the conversation's being had across everyone? It's just an observation. And yes, even Kareem, I mean, I know you're laughing the most, but when you sit back and listen, you do sound very middle-class English. So it's just an observation, not a criticism at all, just an observation.
It's not an objective
observation.
It's
called code switching.
It's cool, but this is my public speaking voice.
Right, exactly.
Come and chill at home.
When you're in the yard.
I understand that. But we're all bilingual. We're not. I know what you're saying, and I've become aware of it as I've got older. Even my English teacher was in secondary school. She said to me once, she said, Kareem, you write completely different to how you talk. And because she was shocked. I gave her this essay, and she couldn't believe I could talk like this, because I'm usually effing and blinding.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And I think actually we are all bilingual without being aware of it. I mean, we're going off topic now, but I don't know. Let someone else go.
I mean, it's a really interesting point, because I mean, I grew up in Tottenham. I've resisted swearing on this panel when I wanted to, but. Yeah, no, I know, but okay, you're right. It's not about profanity. It's about being able to get your point communicated where you need to. And this is, with this particular audience, maybe I'm making a complete sweeping generalisation. Is this an academic audience? I don't know. Am I able to connect with them and get my points and articulate my ideas? I think I'm able to. But when I'm working with young people say, when I go back to Tottenham, or if I'm working in South London, or if I'm working in East London, I am able to communicate with them as well, because I meet them where they're at. You've got to meet people where they're at. And that's why I talked about the word code switching. I hate the word code switching, but what I've got available to me is a whole palette of language and musicality of language that I can access to communicate my ideas. My ideas don't become dumbed down when I'm speaking to a group of young people, or speaking from somebody from a different community, from different communities. It doesn't get dumbed down. It's just as intense. It's just as potent. But I have to meet people where they're at.
I think the substantive point of the question got lost in that insult of being accused.
No, it's not an insult. She's right.
No. It's not an insult, okay, but a kind of overstatement of where we're at, because you don't know any of us in terms of where that comes from at all. And I don't feel that it's necessary to apologise for that. But the substantive point that I thought you were making was that there isn't that knowledge and awareness within differing, what are called ethnic minority communities, that some people might claim. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Sorry, because we're so short on time, I just wanted to make sure we got that point right. So, is there a lack of awareness amongst some of the communities that is less, that they're less aware than white working class?
No, I don't think so. I think it's about networks connecting. It's about people knowing, because people are isolated because they think it's a white middle class kind of thing. Yeah. This is why I was saying at the very beginning, it's a definition of what an activist looks like. I'm sitting around here and I know a couple of people in here who are hardcore activists, but it's about getting out there. Usually you don't have a support network, you don't have the resources, you don't have access to the mediums that are able to get you out there so that you are known. It takes time, and it takes podcasts like this, and it takes opportunities, to be able to connect with people, and keeping your ear to the ground. Like, if you belong to Colourful Radio, make a call out to people who are greening their communities, who have allotments, which is where a lot of Caribbean people were growing food when they couldn't actually afford food, when they came over in the Windrush era. So people have been doing this work, but it's what an activist or an environmental activist looks like, and this is where I call attention to Extinction Rebellion and their MO.
Can I just very, very, very quickly go back to Julian's question, please, Anna?
Yeah, I have an answer for you, Julie. Which is, so the introduction of Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, in the introduction, she talks about this idea of looking away, and how we consistently look away. And we look at climate change and it terrifies us, and we look away. And we have this constant, we recycle and we think, oh, I've done my bit now, and we continue looking away. And so I read this and it kind of stayed with me, and I thought about how we keep looking at it. And then, in my writing again, I reread Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic as Power, which is probably my Bible essay for life. And I've been reading it for about 10 years. Repeatedly. And here I am, again, with my old friend reading it, and she's saying the exact same thing. And she literally uses the phrase, looking away. And how we cannot, or not that we cannot, of course we absolutely can, but how we are not staying present with our own bodies, our own power, our own sensuality, and this causes us to be dislocated and disconnected from everything else going away. And I think that that's something to really come back to, is this idea of how do we stay present with all that is, with all the horror that is, but also how do we find that to be a pleasurable pursuit? How do we look at reconnecting with the sensuality of our bodies and the sensuality of the non-human life that's all around us and find that to be a pleasurable pursuit? I think Ron Finlay, the Los Angelian amazing quote-unquote gangster gardener, says, how do we make greenness sexy? How do we make gardening sexy? And, I don't think it's about commercializing it. I think it's about saying, well, what's sexy to me? I mean, the smell of freshly cut grass is one of, my biggest turn-ons. So, how do I come back to finding ways that aren't through horror and aren't through sacrifice and are actually about rooting myself in the pleasures of my body and that being about a part of climate justice.
Thank you, Anna, Kareem, Zena and Judy. Thank you so much for participating in the podcast and for giving us your insights this morning. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you all once again. It was such a pleasure to meet you all as well and to get to know all of your work over the course of recording the podcast. It was really interesting for me to sit on the side and just listen in and see all of the spaces that you took us to as well. It was really lovely. So we've got a few minutes for you to all get up and move around and have a drink of water. So at 11:45, we have a session in the Franks room, which is signposted around either of those doors, and that's on access to nature in urban spaces, and that's with Kareem and Andrea Carter from D6. And in here, we'll have a panel on sustainable food, so that's with Judy and Caroline Ward from Squirrel Nation. If you're staying in here, I'd still encourage you to get up and move around and have a bit of a chat. So we've got a room of, quite a number of creative organisations and artists and funders and policymakers, so please make the most of it. Thank you.
Thank you.